Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. President Yoon Suk Yeol had a hectic schedule last week after visiting Indonesia to participate in meetings with leaders of Southeast Asian nations. He was then off to India for the G20 Summit and more talks with heads of state before returning home on Monday. In Jakarta, President Yoon stressed that the international community should respond firmly to North Korea's missile threats, while also asking China to assist in halting Pyongyang's aggressive behavior. And in New Delhi, the president made a financial pledge to help fund the fight against climate change and offered more aid to Ukraine. On the sidelines of such multilateral gatherings, he held bilateral meetings with the leaders of more than 20 countries, strengthening ties with each one of them. So how was President Yoon's diplomatic super week overall? For more on this, we have invited Professor Mason Ritchie from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Professor Lee Min-jung from Gwangju National University. Good to see you, Professor Lim.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, first question, Professor Lim. To more recent news, President Yoon was in India for the G20, his second time to participate in the summit following last year's edition in Bali, Indonesia. And as we all know, the summit took place without the leaders of China and Russia present. So what significance did this year's G20 meeting have, and how did you see President Yoon's attendance there?
Well, above all, I felt like this year's G20 was an opportunity to see the growing presence of the so-called global South in the international society. As you just explained, Russia, which is currently at war with Ukraine, was represented by the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, instead of President Putin, as it was in Bali, Indonesia last year. And China, too, was also represented by Premier Li Qiang, not President Xi Jinping. So the G20 has been important to China because it includes a wider range of countries than the G7, which is more of the Western industrialized nation. So President Xi actually every year he attended the G20 meeting, but this year he skipped it. So there have been kind of many different analyses, our guesses of his absence. And meanwhile, this specific G20 is seen by many experts as a kind of diplomatic success or victory for the host country, India, in part because it did not include a specific direct criticism of Russia in its joint declaration, and in part because it showed the leadership of India as a kind of, again, the leading nation of the global South. Again, they succeeded in adding African Union, a grouping of African countries, as a new member. And President Yoon, this was his second time to join the G20. And one Earth, one family, one future, this was the theme. And I think, again, the President Yoon was trying to use this opportunity as a diplomatic appeal for South Korea to fulfill its global responsibility.
All right. Well, this time's G20 summit apparently seems to have a lot of significance in many ways. Now, Professor Ritchie, let's focus on President Yoon's remarks as well. So he announced a plan to contribute $300 million to Green Climate Fund. What was your take on such a pledge?
I really think that this is a way for the Yoon administration to try to put another foot forward and stand out a little bit in terms of the fight to reduce the effects of climate change. This, what they call replenishment, is the second replenishment that South Korea has made. And the second one is a 50% increase over the first replenishment that it made. So I think that that's actually putting a pretty big step forward, and most of the international community has really welcomed this amount. We need to understand, of course, what this is. The Green Climate Fund is the operational entity that supports the financing mechanism to try to reduce global greenhouse gases from developing countries and finances their adaptation of their industry and their technology so that they can produce less global greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is a development component to this as well, which I think coordinates well with South Korea's desire to step up as a global pivotal state. And of course, if you want to step up as a global pivotal state, you also have to come to the table with money. There's just no way around it. The last thing I'll say is this should be expected in some ways. After all, the Green Climate Fund is located in Incheon. If you're going to have the headquarters there, you're going to have some added responsibility as well. So it's welcome, but also a relatively low bar to cross.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Im, while mapping out Seoul's role and contribution to building a free, rules-based international order, President Yoon also pledged $2.3 billion to support recovery efforts in Ukraine as well. How did you evaluate such a pledge?
President Yoon said, quote, again, the norm-based international order has been the foundation of human peace and prosperity since World War II. And he also highlighted in all cases, again, universally accepted principles and norms must continue to be respected. So I think this kind of remarks reveals his firm belief in the rule-based world order can help, again, not only just some specific country, but also for all. And he added that South Korea plans to provide an additional $300 million in free development cooperation, including humanitarian assistance and support through the international financial organizations next year for Ukraine, and will actively also help Ukraine rebuild with a medium or long-term support package of more than $2 billion, again, US dollar, as you just described. So despite the lack of direct condemnation of Russia this time, as I mentioned earlier, there are several possible explanations, I think, for South Korea's more direct support for the Ukraine. First, this year is the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Korean War armistice. And for South Korea, which was invaded by the North Korea 73 years ago, there is a sense of moral obligations to reciprocate by reminding itself and the world that the international community helped this country and it contributed to the freedom and the prosperity of this country. And secondly, South Korea has a lot of know-how in infrastructure building or city building too. So I think that there was a kind of practical judgment that there will be opportunity for South Korean related industries as well to economically benefit from those reconstruction of Ukraine.
Right, I see. So we were able to see more contributions that South Korea wanted to make for the global society. Now, Professor Ritchie, we have been talking about remarks from President Yoon Suk Yeol, but on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, he also had a lot of bilateral meetings with other countries' leaders. Now, what stood out the most?
I think two things for me stood out the most. The first of which is, we saw a lot of these bilateral meetings happen with other middle powers. I mean, obviously there was there were the meetings with the Chinese representative. There was obviously this sideline meeting with Biden. And those are to be expected, of course, and they're important because they're great powers. But we saw Yoon really also turn to the developing world a little bit with Africa, and in particular other middle powers. And I think that that's important because we've seen the Yoon administration really tilt towards building up or rebuilding, if you want to look at it this way, the alliance with the United States in the security space while trying to manage some of the downsides of the rocky relationship occasionally with China. And here you see I think the third element of the overall foreign policy, which is to have a set of relations, including obviously economic, but cultural and security with other partners as well. And so we look at some of these countries that we call the MICTA countries. You take Mexico, for instance, where Yoon had a meeting. Mexico is a country that counts on South Korea as its #3 trade partner, which I think perhaps might be surprising to some people how significant that relationship is. And it covers everything from cars to minerals. And of course, in some sense, Mexico acts as a sort of hinge between Asia and the Americas for South Korea. So it's strategically important for South Korea to keep that relationship alive as well. Obviously, in Indonesia, we saw a business roundtable. We saw a lot of business deals being signed there in various different areas. And of course, Indonesia is important and increasingly so for raw materials that are coming from outside of China. And then when you look at Turkey, here you've got a country that's in NATO, and of course now with South Korea increasingly playing a role in NATO as a member of the AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4, along with Australia and Japan and New Zealand. Obviously, Turkey is also important because South Korea is trying to sell nuclear reactors there. So there's a business component to that. And then when you look at Australia, this is a real growing relationship between like-minded countries that are allies of the United States. And in particular, with Australia, South Korea has an increasing arms industry that's growing there. So, in addition to trying to move away from the sort of great power competition focused, relationship that South Korea is trying to grow, there's a lot of different issues and interests that South Korea has with some of these middle powers. And I think that was one of the things that stood out to me.
Interesting. Right, I see. Now, Professor Im, before the G20 summit, Yoon had a 4-day visit to Indonesia as well to attend annual summits involving ASEAN countries, where he showed his support for ASEAN-led regional architecture. What is this exactly, and what role are ASEAN countries expected to play in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, the geostrategic position of ASEAN countries has become even more relevant as the strategic competition between China and the United States intensifies. In addition, the recent economic downturn in China has made it more necessary for South Korea-like country to look for alternative market to the Chinese market, or to even replace imports of the key products or the materials from China, as just Professor Rich explained very well. In ASEAN perspective on the Indo-Pacific, its acronym is AOIP, which was released in the 2019, it is evaluated as the first official response of the Southeast Asian country through the ASEAN mechanism to the latest geopolitical developments in the region. So AOIP follows the tradition of ASEAN's tradition of those hedging diplomacy, and reaffirms its previous stance while offering no radical changes. ASEAN countries, again, have traditionally maintained a more like a neutral position rather than aligning themselves with one camp or the other. So they are trying to carve, I think, carve out their own path in the context of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry and the Russia-West confrontation, especially after the war in Ukraine. So AOIP also seeks to coordinate East Asia's proliferating but competing regional cooperation frameworks by emphasizing ASEAN centrality and proposing connectivity.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Rich, it was quite interesting for me to see how President Yoon referred to the recent Camp David Trilateral Summit at the ASEAN-related summits. And there he said that Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing are determined to coordinate their own Indo-Pacific strategies and explore more cooperation, opportunities with ASEAN countries. How are these countries looking at the cooperation with the ASEAN bloc?
Well, I think answering that question to some degree makes me question really what it would mean for Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing to coordinate their Indo-Pacific strategies, because in the first place, they're competitive. Japan, kind of got a bit of a head start over South Korea in terms of opening up business, commercial, and trade opportunities in Southeast Asia. And South Korea has been playing catch up, and it's been doing a relatively good job at it. But that just means that the competition between Japan and South Korea in the private sector to engage in business deals and grow their commercial presence in Southeast Asia is intensifying. And of course, we already know, obviously, that China is tremendously important for ASEAN countries, and is in fact a preferred partner for a number of states there. So I don't exactly know how they're supposed to coordinate given the amount of competitiveness within the business world there. Secondly, I think that it's important to understand that China doesn't look at ASEAN, I think, the way that, for instance, Tokyo and Seoul and many other countries in quote unquote the West do, where at least there's a lip service to what we call ASEAN centrality, which is to say that ASEAN is supposed to be taken as a group, and it's supposed to be central to the issues that take place in the Southeast Asian space, notably in the maritime space. China, however, tends to prefer not to deal with ASEAN as a bloc group, precisely because China can use its disproportionate economic and population size to get a significant amount of leverage over the ASEAN members bilaterally rather than dealing with them as a bloc. So there's a sort of fundamental diplomatic difference, a different approach to the way it is that Beijing versus Seoul and Tokyo tends to look at ASEAN. So I'm not really sure exactly what the coordination is supposed to be. I think if I'm being charitable, I would find it in areas that what we would call public goods, or regional public goods. So perhaps global public health, climate change, counter piracy, criminal enterprises and that sort of thing. I can imagine there could be some coordination there, but on some of these larger issues, and particularly in the highly competitive trade space, I think coordination is going to prove quite challenging.
Right, I see. Professor Ritchie, I'd like to ask you one more question. Since you have brought up the China issue, let's tap on the East Asia Summit as well. There, President Yoon said that North Korea could strike all the countries involved in the East Asia Summit, and he also stressed the responsibility of the permanent nations of the UNSC. What would have been his intention behind such remarks?
I think, in the first place, talking about, where North Korea can strike anywhere, I mean, that's just a way of rallying support, I think, for countries in Southeast Asia who probably don't look primarily at North Korea as being a threat, at least not a particularly significant one. And I think it is important to remind the rest of the world that North Korea, in principle, could hit anywhere, right? I mean, ICBMs can be targeted anywhere. They can't only, they're not only targetable in the U.S. and in South Korea or in Japan. So I think it's a way of reminding the rest of the world, especially countries that perhaps don't have North Korea on their radar as much, that North Korea is a risk. And what's important about the Southeast Asian countries is that, historically and to this day, they remain sites, for instance, where sanctions are laxly enforced. Where it is that North Korea can continue to do business on the types of goods that are covered by sanctions that it needs in order to advance its missile and nuclear programs, or just its economy more generally, in contravention of international sanctions. Of course, behind that, Yoon is also clearly sending a message not only to the ASEAN states, but he's also sending a message to China as well, that he expects China to do a better job of enforcing the sanctions that it's already agreed to at the United Nations Security Council, and entertaining future sanctions if North Korea continues to test missiles or goes through with an upcoming nuclear test, again, in contravention of its international obligations. I don't expect that will have much of an effect on Beijing, but I think he's at least sort of obligated to make that point.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Lim, there were many bilateral meetings in Jakarta as well, and President Yoon actually signed an FTA with the Philippines, marking the 5th bilateral free trade pact inked with an ASEAN member. And not only that, South Korea also agreed to further strengthen their ties, their relationship, by signing 6 cooperation documents with Indonesia as well. Could you tell us more about such bilaterals that took place at Jakarta?
Sure. On September 8th, the Friday, the President Yoon Suk Yeol had a summit with his counterpart, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, celebrating the actually 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between South Korea and Indonesia. And during the meeting, The two leaders congratulated, of course, the two countries on their remarkable development in the relationship in actually various fields, like including, of course, politics, economy, society, and even cultural exchange in the half century since the establishment of the diplomatic ties. And they also discussed on more like a future-oriented practical cooperation for the coming years as well. On the occasion of the meeting, the two leaders welcomed the signing MOUs on the industrial cooperation in the fields of, for example, automobiles or steel, petrochemicals, and the digital economy as well, and intellectual property protection, or EV, electric vehicle ecosystem, or even halal food. So as we know, again, Indonesia has been a kind of leading role in the ASEAN framework with a population of 270 million people, and it is also very rich in resources, and it does have a very important geostrategic location. So having had all this, potential, it looks like the two leaders of the two countries agreed on the more like various field for the future cooperation.
Right, I see. We'll be able to look forward to much more cooperation with these countries. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Lim, for your time and insights. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Ritchie, for your time as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, as usual.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.